The dust from the HOA-mandated asphalt settled on Elias Thorne's boots, a gray film on the worn leather. It was a tangible metaphor for his life in the past 6 months, a fine, choking layer of bureaucratic nonsense coating the rugged, authentic existence he had built for himself. The source of the dust and all his troubles was a gleaming white Mercedes SUV parked 50 yards from his property line. Mrs. Albright, the newly elected and self-appointed head of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, sat inside, texting furiously on a phone that cost more than his entire livestock feed budget for the year. The gate was gone, or what was left of it. A 200-pound pine post, splintered at the base, lay on the roadside like a felled soldier. The heavy wrought iron hinge, a family heirloom from Elias's grandfather, was twisted into an unrecognizable abstract sculpture. The entire structure, which had stood as a proud symbol of his family's independence for 3 generations, now resembled a piece of modern art created by a very angry, very wealthy person. Elias walked slowly towards the wreckage, each step measured. He didn't need to look at the tire tracks. He knew the distinct pattern of her all-terrain radials, a cruel irony given her aversion to anything remotely resembling nature. She had done it again, a brazen, almost theatrical act of passive-aggressive assault. This was more than a dispute over property lines or aesthetic standards. It was a war for territory. Elias, Mrs. Albright's voice, a saccharine sweet blend of southern charm and pure venom, cut through the quiet hum of the countryside. She emerged from her vehicle, adjusting the crisp white blazer over her blouse. She carried a clipboard like a royal scepter. "I do hope you're not upset." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, the same shade of blue as a glacial lake, were as cold and unfeeling as the concrete she demanded her neighbors pave their driveways with. Elias stopped a few feet from her, a mountain of a man dwarfing her in her polished kitten heels. "My gate, Eleanor." "You've destroyed my gate." "Oh, that old thing?" "It was an eyesore, Elias, you know that. The covenants are very clear about the use of unvarnished timber and rustic hardware." She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand at the mangled hinge, a theatrical sneer playing on her lips. "It simply doesn't fit the aesthetic of our community." "This isn't your community, Eleanor. This is my ranch. My family has owned this land for 80 years. The HOA boundary stops at my fence line and the gate is on my property. You had no right. A gate of that nature with its unkempt appearance is a detriment to the property values of everyone else in Meadow Creek. I did it for the good of the community." Elias felt the familiar surge of red-hot anger. He had been through this song and dance before. 3 times she had vandalized his gate. He had filed a police report the first time. The officer, a young man who looked perpetually stressed, had chalked it up to a civil dispute. The HOA board, in their first meeting after her election, had voted to sanction him for non-compliance with an obscure clause about maintaining a harmonious visual flow. They had all been bought and sold, won over by her potluck casseroles and her relentless, micromanaging presence. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Mrs. Albright laughed, a brittle, sharp sound that grated on his nerves. "Oh, Elias, we both know you can't afford a lawyer who can take on the full legal team of the Meadow Creek Estates HOA. We've already received 2 estimates for the removal of your salvage and the installation of a new conforming entrance. We'll be sending you the bill." She climbed back into her car, pulling the door shut with a solid thud. He stood there, watching as she drove away, the tires kicking up more dust, a mocking little cloud that trailed her down the pristine paved road. The dust settled on him, on the ruins of his gate, and on the last remaining fragments of his patience. He walked back to his barn, the rage in his gut a living, coiling thing. Inside, surrounded by the familiar scent of hay and machine oil, he ran a hand over the smooth, cool steel of his late father's welding equipment. His dad had taught him how to build, not how to fight a war of attrition with a clipboard. But a new kind of idea was beginning to take root in his mind, something hard and unyielding, just like the metal under his fingers. He had tried to play by her rules, to use their system against her. The police, the HOA, the pathetic threat of a lawyer. None of it had worked. Their system was designed to protect people like her. It was a rigged game. So he had to change the rules. The next morning, the scene of the crime was a flurry of activity. The splintered post was hauled away. The twisted hinge, now a relic, was carefully placed in his workshop. Then a new post, an old telephone pole he had salvaged, was set in the ground. It was twice as thick and reinforced with rebar and concrete. He welded a new frame from a solid steel beam, a testament to raw, unyielding strength. It was a gate that would stop a tank. But with a new coat of dark green paint and a classic design, it looked perfectly normal, simple, elegant, and impossibly strong. The final piece of his plan was the most crucial. He spent an entire afternoon meticulously embedding 3 miniature wireless cameras, no bigger than a dime, into the fence posts and the gate itself. They were concealed by a clever combination of mud and paint, angled perfectly to capture every inch of the road, the gate, and the driver's seat of a very specific white SUV. He linked the cameras to a hidden server in his workshop and a mobile app on his phone. The next 3 days were a torment of anticipation. He watched the white Mercedes pass by, sometimes slowly, sometimes with a dismissive speed. The tension built with every passing hour. He found himself standing at the window, staring out at the new, imposing gate, his heart a drum against his ribs. He was not waiting for an attack. He was waiting for the perfect moment for her to make her final, irreversible mistake. On the 4th day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, the camera alert on his phone pinged. He watched as the familiar shape of the Mercedes pulled up to the gate. He saw her, a triumphant smirk on her face, leaning forward to engage the all-terrain radials. He watched her car's nose point at the gate, her foot pressing down on the accelerator. Her plan was simple, another casual act of vandalism, a moment of dominance captured for her own satisfaction. She was so sure of her power, so certain of her impunity. He watched, a grim smile spreading across his face as the SUV gathered speed. The image on his screen, crisp and clear, showed a single-minded woman on a mission of destruction. She was about to destroy the last remnant of his patience. But as the car approached, her smirk faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered surprise. The gate, so innocuous and simple in its design, wasn't yielding. It held, immovable and unyielding, a steel wall masquerading as a wooden fence. The sickening crunch that followed was not of wood or metal, but of expensive German sheet metal and shattered fiberglass. Her smug, victorious expression instantly twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The camera captured it all. She couldn't dodge this one. The trap was sprung. Elias stood in the hushed, cavernous space of his workshop, the glow of his phone illuminating a grim smile on his face. He watched the scene unfold on the screen. Mrs. Albright, head snapping forward with the sudden, violent stop of the Mercedes. The airbags deployed in a cloud of white, shrouding the shattered windshield and the mangled front grille. The smug, triumphant expression from moments before had been replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked like a bird that had flown headfirst into a plate glass window, a creature of privilege now faced with the harsh, unyielding reality of consequence. He zoomed in on her face, on the way her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, on the frantic, bewildered terror in her eyes as she realized what she had just done. It was the face of a person who had never faced a genuine obstacle in her life, and it was a sight Elias would cherish for a long, long time. He felt the rage that had been his constant companion for months begin to dissipate, replaced by a cool, calm sense of vindication. He wasn't a man who celebrated others' misfortune, but this wasn't misfortune. This was justice. It was karma, served cold and swift on a plate of reinforced steel. He pocketed the phone, the video a digital shield and sword in one. He stepped out of the barn and began to walk, his stride purposeful and deliberate, towards the scene of the accident. The air was still thick with the smell of ozone and burnt rubber. The white Mercedes was a grotesque sight, its front end accordion folded, a cruel mockery of its pristine status. Mrs. Albright, now free of her airbag, was trying to open the driver's side door. But the metal was buckled, warped, and immovable. She was trapped. Her face, visible through the cracked window, was blotchy and streaked with mascara. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a wild, disheveled mess. The clipboard, her scepter of power, was gone, likely thrown somewhere in the chaotic interior. Elias stopped a few feet from the car, hands in the pockets of his jeans. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. He simply watched, the silence a weapon more potent than any shouted accusation. Finally, she saw him. Her head snapped up, and her eyes, wide with panic and humiliation, locked onto his. "Elias," she shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. "What did you do?" "I reinforced my gate, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was falling apart. "I fixed it. You knew. You knew I was going to do this. This is a trap. This is a setup," she screamed, pounding on the car window with a frustrated fist. "I didn't know anything," Elias said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "I just installed a gate that meets my security needs. Looks like it met them perfectly. This is criminal," she wailed. "I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you're worth." Elias pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing in the fading light. He held it up, displaying the video of her car driving towards the gate. "You'll notice that my cameras were rolling," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You'll also notice that there's a clear view of you accelerating into my property. No one forced you. No one put your foot on the gas. This was all you." The blood drained from her face. Her eyes, once so cold and calculating, were now filled with a genuine, palpable fear. The bravado, the carefully constructed facade of power, vanished in an instant. She was just a frightened, trapped woman in a wrecked luxury car. Just then, the wail of a police siren cut through the twilight, a harsh, unwelcome intrusion. Elias glanced down the road. It was a patrol car from the county sheriff's office. He braced himself for a new level of bureaucracy, a new layer of injustice. He had the video, yes, but he also knew how these things worked. People like Mrs. Albright had connections. They had influence. He wasn't naive enough to think this was over. The car pulled up, and Officer Miller, the same perpetually stressed young man from before, stepped out. He took one look at the scene, the wrecked Mercedes, the imposing, undamaged gate, the stone-faced Elias, and the panicked Mrs. Albright, and his face fell. He knew what this was. Another nightmare of a civil dispute, but this one was on a whole new level. "Mrs. Albright? Elias? What happened here?" Miller asked, his tone already weary. Mrs. Albright, seeing her opportunity, began to scream. "Officer, he did this! He set a trap. He destroyed my car. He's a menace to the community." Elias didn't even flinch. He just held up his phone. "Officer, if you'll take a look at this, you'll see exactly what happened." Officer Miller, looking skeptical, approached. He watched the video, his expression shifting with every second. He saw the car speed up, saw the woman's face, saw the moment of impact, and saw the aftermath. The video was irrefutable. It showed a deliberate act of aggression, not a simple accident. His eyes widened as he watched the smug, arrogant face of Mrs. Albright turn into a grotesque mask of panic. This wasn't a civil dispute. This was a criminal act. "Ma'am," Miller said, his voice firm and no longer weary. "Step out of the car, please." Mrs. Albright's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. He's the one who's been harassing me. His property is an eyesore. This is a setup, I tell you." "Ma'am, I have a clear video here of you intentionally driving into a piece of private property," Miller said, his patience gone. "I'm going to need to see your license and registration." But the climax of the evening was still to come. Just as Miller was taking her information, a black town car, sleek and imposing, pulled up behind the patrol car. A man in a tailored suit, with the tired, drawn face of someone who handled other people's crises for a living, emerged. He was Mrs. Albright's husband, Richard Albright, a powerful real estate developer and the true puppet master behind his wife's HOA reign. His presence was not a coincidence. He had likely been monitoring her location via GPS. He took one look at the wreckage, at his wife's disheveled state, and at Elias, and his face hardened. This was a man who was used to winning, to having problems simply disappear. He walked past the officer without a word, his gaze fixed on Elias. The air crackled with a new, far more dangerous kind of tension. This was no longer a squabble between a rancher and an HOA bully. This was a showdown between two men, one who stood for the land and the other who stood for everything that was trying to pave over it. Richard Albright, his voice low and dangerous, said, "This is far from over, Thorne. You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words were a promise, a threat, and a turning point. The fight had just gone from a local skirmish to a full-blown war, and the stakes had just gone through the roof. The air was electric, thick with the unspoken challenge hanging between the two men. Richard Albright, a man accustomed to having the world bend to his will, stood a few feet from the wreckage of his wife's Mercedes. His perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to Elias's worn-out jeans and flannel shirt, seemed to absorb the twilight and emit a silent, oppressive power. The weary officer, caught between a local dispute and a very serious conflict, looked like he wished he were anywhere else in the world. "You're the one who fixed this gate, Thorne?" Richard's voice was low, a rumbling freight train of menace. He didn't raise his voice because he never had to. His power was in the quiet, in the way he could make things disappear. "It was falling apart," Elias replied, his own voice steady, refusing to buckle under the weight of the man's presence. "I fixed it, with the deliberate intention of causing damage to my wife's property," Richard said, his eyes dark and sharp, boring into Elias. "I'm not a fool." "This was a trap." Elias held up his phone. "This video shows my gate was installed on my property. It also shows your wife accelerating into it. That's not a trap. That's a consequence. She made a choice." Richard's gaze flickered to the officer, who shifted uncomfortably. "Officer Miller, I'm sure you're aware that this kind of entrapment, this kind of malicious sabotage, is a serious legal matter. I'm prepared to press charges against Mr. Thorne for property damage, criminal negligence, and reckless endangerment." "Sir," Miller said, trying to maintain a professional tone despite his visible nervousness, "the video clearly shows your wife was the one acting recklessly. She drove into a stationary object on private property. She could be facing reckless driving charges and possibly a criminal investigation for the repeated destruction of Mr. Thorne's property." Richard's mouth thinned into a hard, unforgiving line. His eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, a mask of pure reptilian rage fell over his face. He knew his wife's history. He had paid off the previous incidents. He had used his influence to get her elected to the HOA board, to give her the petty fiefdom she so craved. But this was different. This was public, and it was caught on camera. He couldn't make this simply vanish. He took a step closer to Elias. "Let's be reasonable, Thorne. This whole mess is just a misunderstanding. Give me that video, and we'll forget this ever happened. I'll have my insurance cover the car, and I'll even pay to have a new professional gate installed for you, one that conforms to the HOA standards." The offer was a thinly veiled bribe, a last-ditch attempt to buy his way out of a public humiliation. "No," Elias said. The word was a solid, unyielding rock. "This isn't about a gate. This is about what's right. And it's about a line you people keep trying to cross." Richard's eyes flashed with something darker than anger. It was the cold recognition of an enemy who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He pulled out his own phone, and with a few rapid taps, the entire mood of the scene shifted. He wasn't threatening with words anymore. He was using his true currency, power. He spoke in a low, even tone, his voice audible only to Elias and the officer. "I want a full file on this property. The original deed, the development zoning, every legal document from the last 80 years. And I want the HOA bylaws, every single one including any dormant clauses. I want them on my desk by morning." He snapped the phone shut and gave Elias a chilling smile. "You've just signed a different kind of contract, Thorne. You just chose to have a real war." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked to the wrecked Mercedes, opened the back door, and began to speak to his terrified wife in hushed, angry tones. They were no longer a part of this scene. They were simply a problem he would solve, a temporary setback to a much grander plan. The next day, Elias received an official-looking document in his mailbox. It was a formal notice from the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It was not a fine. It was not a warning. It was a declaration of a new kind of war. The letter, signed by every member of the HOA board, meticulously cited a dormant clause in the original founding charter, Section 917B, titled Strategic Community Development. The clause stated that if a property's continued use was deemed to unreasonably impede the overall strategic development and aesthetic continuity of the community, the HOA had the right to initiate a compulsory purchase of the property at its appraised fair market value. This wasn't about a gate. It wasn't even about Mrs. Albright's humiliation. This was about Elias's land. The letter claimed his continued operation of a rustic and non-conforming ranch was in direct violation of the clause. It stated that the board had voted unanimously to initiate the purchase process, and that a team of appraisers would be on his property within the week. Elias sat at his kitchen table, the paper shaking in his hands. This was a whole new level of cold, calculated malice. Richard Albright wasn't interested in petty fines or criminal charges. He was a real estate developer. He didn't see a home. He saw an impediment to a larger, more profitable venture. He saw a ranch that could be raised and replaced with a dozen more luxury homes. This was a power play of the highest order. They weren't just taking his land. They were using the very system that was supposed to protect his neighbors to steal his family's legacy. He looked out the window at the vast expanse of his ranch. The land had been in his family for generations. The land was in his blood. His grandfather had built the house with his bare hands. His father had taught him to farm and to be a good steward of the land. It wasn't a property to be bought and sold. It was home. He grabbed the phone and called his lawyer, the same one who had sighed and told him a civil dispute was a losing battle. The lawyer listened to Elias's panicked, furious account of the notice. There was a long, unsettling silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the lawyer said, "Elias, this is a problem." "A big problem." "They're not bluffing." Elias hung up the phone, a cold knot of dread twisting in his stomach. The fight had escalated from a petty feud to an all-out existential war. The video of the crash, once a source of triumph, now felt like a meaningless footnote. He had won the battle, but he had just started to realize he was about to lose the war, and he was about to lose everything. The notice of compulsory purchase was not a threat. It was a cold surgical declaration. Elias Thorne sat at his kitchen table, the paper a flimsy but lethal weapon in his hand. The words were sterile, the legal jargon designed to remove all emotion from the act of stealing his home. It detailed the timeline, appraisers in a week, a formal offer within 30 days, and if he refused, a forced purchase through eminent domain, a legal maneuver that would steamroll his family's 80-year legacy in the name of strategic community development. Richard Albright wasn't playing a game. He was initiating a hostile takeover. The video of Mrs. Albright's humiliated face, once a source of bitter triumph, now felt like a punchline to a dark joke. He had won the battle only to lose the war. The victory was a cruel illusion, a distraction from the real, far more devastating attack that was brewing beneath the surface. He had fought the wrong enemy, on the wrong battlefield. His hands-on, defiant methods meant nothing to a man who saw land not as a home, but as a ledger. He spent the next few days in a fog of impotent rage and despair. He tried to talk to his neighbors, the other members of the HOA board. The Johnsons, who he'd helped mend a fence for just last year, avoided his calls. The Millers, whose son he'd taught to fish, claimed they had no choice. They all sounded the same, a chorus of weak, apologetic voices. "It's for the good of the community," they'd say, a regurgitated line that felt like a betrayal. They were terrified of Richard, of his power, of his retribution. They had all been bought and intimidated. When the appraisers arrived, they came in a black SUV that was too clean for the dirt road. They were two men in beige khakis and starched polo shirts, carrying clipboards and laser measuring tools. They looked less like human beings and more like an extension of the paperwork in his hand. They didn't see the love and sweat that built the barn, or the generations of family history in the creaking floorboards of the house. They saw square footage, acreage, and a zoning classification that they believed was about to change. "We're just doing our job, Mr. Thorne," one of them said, a man named Carl, with a face as bland as a sheet of drywall. He held out a hand for a handshake, but Elias kept his hands in his pockets. "This is my home," Elias said, his voice raw. "We understand," the other appraiser said, his words a hollow echo. "We're simply determining its fair market value." The fair market value, Elias knew, would be an insulting fraction of what the land was worth to him. It would be a price designed to make him feel powerless, a gesture to show him that his life's work could be erased with a signature. After they left, the silence of the ranch was deafening. The only sound was the wind whispering through the old fence posts, a sad elegy for a home that was about to be lost. He called his lawyer again, and the conversation was even bleaker than before. "Elias," the lawyer said, his voice heavy with resignation, "the clause is airtight. It's a relic, but it's legal. And the HOA board voted unanimously. They have a legal right to initiate the purchase. We can fight it, but it'll be a long, expensive process with no guarantee of success. Richard Albright has the resources to bury us in litigation for years, so I just lose?" Elias's voice was a desperate whisper. "Unless you can find something that invalidates the clause, or the vote, or something that makes the entire HOA charter moot, something they didn't anticipate. Something outside the law." The words hung in the air long after the call ended. Something outside the law. It was the same conclusion he had come to when faced with the gate. The law, their system, was rigged. He had to go back to his own methods, to think like the man who built a trap, not the man who filled out paperwork. Elias walked into the workshop. He wasn't looking at the video of the crash anymore. He was looking at the old legal documents his father had left in a dusty box. He hadn't touched them in years. They were filled with dense, archaic language. The original deeds from the 1940s, the zoning permits from the 1970s, and the founding charter of the Meadow Creek Estates HOA from the 1980s. He had dismissed them as old paperwork, but the lawyer's words echoed in his mind. He needed to find something they had missed. He spread the documents out on his workbench, the yellowed pages a timeline of his family's existence on this land. He read for hours, poring over every clause, every line. His eyes scanned for anything that looked out of place, any anomaly that could give him a foothold. The details of the HOA charter were particularly tedious. They were a monument to pettiness. Clauses on mailbox colors, lawn maintenance, and acceptable Christmas decorations. He found the infamous Section 917B, the Strategic Community Development Clause, tucked away on page 47. He read it over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration. It seemed unassailable. He was about to give up when his eyes drifted to a faded, handwritten note tucked inside the folder with the original charter. It was his father's handwriting, a few scrawled lines that read, "Old Albright insisted on this clause. Told me it was for the good of the community. But he didn't tell me the whole story." Elias felt a jolt of adrenaline. Old Albright, Richard's father. The original developer of Meadow Creek Estates. Elias's father had known him, a fact he had completely forgotten. He knew his dad wouldn't have let a thing like this slide without a reason. He began to search for any historical record of the original development. He remembered a box of old news clippings and photos in the attic. He found it in a forgotten corner, dusty and cobwebbed. Inside, nestled amongst pictures of his grandfather's prize-winning cattle, were dozens of articles from the local paper from the 1980s. He found it, buried deep in the archives of a local paper, a single article with a grainy photo. It was about the original development of Meadow Creek Estates. The headline read, "Developer promises new community lake. Public access guaranteed." The article detailed the initial plans for the neighborhood, a key feature of which was a large man-made lake on the border of the property, a public amenity that was meant to be a selling point for the entire community. It was a condition of the zoning permit. Elias stared at the faded photo of the original blueprint, his heart pounding in his chest. A beautiful, sprawling lake was drawn on the blueprints, right on the border of his family's property line. But there was no lake there. There had never been a lake. Instead, there was a vast open field of dry land, a land his father had once told him with a wry smile was a nice, big field of nothing. He looked at the article, at the official promises, at the public records, and then looked out his window at the barren field. Richard Albright's father had promised a public lake and had built none. And the HOA's founding charter was tied to a zoning agreement that was never fully realized. The strategic development of the community had been a lie from the very beginning. The fair market value they were trying to buy his land for was based on a community that didn't actually exist as promised. The dormant clause they were using was tied to a fraudulent development. It wasn't about a gate. It was about a hidden lie from 40 years ago. Elias hadn't lost the war. He had just found a different, far more devastating weapon. He had found Richard's hidden secret, and it was the one thing he couldn't buy his way out of. The sterile meeting room in the Meadow Creek Estates Community Center felt like a courtroom. Fluorescent lights hummed, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the polished wood table where the HOA board members sat, their faces a mixture of forced solidarity and barely concealed fear. At the head of the table sat Richard Albright, his expression a mask of cold confidence. His wife Eleanor sat beside him, her hand bandaged from the wreck, a quiet, smug smirk on her lips as she watched Elias walk in. They saw this as a formality, the final act in their play to take his land. Elias, however, wasn't there to plead. He wasn't there to beg for mercy. He carried no grand legal briefcase, only a beat-up manila folder. He sat at the far end of the table, facing the entire board alone. His lawyer had warned him against this, but Elias knew this wasn't a battle of legal maneuvers. It was a battle of truth against a lie, and he had the truth in his hands. Richard opened the meeting with a practiced, smooth delivery, laying out the case for the compulsory purchase. He spoke of aesthetics, of property values, and of the community's long-term strategic vision. He painted Elias's ranch as a blight, an obstacle to progress, a stubborn remnant of a bygone era. Eleanor nodded along, her gaze fixed on Elias with a triumphant glint. The other board members, cowed and silent, looked at their hands or at the wall, unable to meet Elias's eye. When Richard finished, he gestured to Elias with a dismissive wave. "Mr. Thorne, do you have any final comments before we move to a final vote?" Elias stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound a jarring note in the quiet room. He walked to the head of the table, his eyes fixed on Richard Albright. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with a calm, quiet authority that commanded attention. "I have no final comments on the vote, Mr. Albright. I have a comment on the very foundation of this board, and the entire legal basis for this meeting." A flicker of surprise, a hint of concern crossed Richard's face. He wasn't used to this kind of defiance. "The foundation is sound, Mr. Thorne. It's based on the founding charter of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." "And that charter," Elias said, laying the faded, yellowed pages on the table, "is based on a lie." He began to speak, his voice gaining momentum. He didn't use legal jargon. He told a story. He told them about the note from his father. He told them about the dusty box in his attic. He told them about the news clippings from the 1980s, about the original developer, Richard's father, who had promised a public, man-made lake as a centerpiece of the community. He laid the old newspaper article next to the original site blueprint, pointing to the spot on the drawing where a beautiful, sprawling lake was supposed to be. This was a condition of the zoning permit. It was a promise made to the county, and a promise made to the people who bought into this community. It was the centerpiece of the strategic community development you claim my property is impeding. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. He then looked at Richard, his gaze unblinking. "Only one problem, Richard. The lake was never built. 40 years ago, your father took a beautiful, sprawling lake and replaced it with a field of nothing. And yet, this HOA and this compulsory purchase clause is still tied to the premise of a strategic development that never actually happened. The entire foundation of your power, of your right to take my land, is built on your family's original fraud." The reaction was immediate and seismic. The other board members began to murmur, their whispered questions growing louder. "A fraudulent zoning agreement?" one of them asked. "The lake was never built?" Another gasped. They had been told for years that the HOA's power was sacrosanct, that it was built on a solid foundation of legal precedent. Now Elias was telling them that it was all a lie, a decades-old deception. Richard, his face a mask of furious desperation, tried to interject. "This is irrelevant! This is a baseless accusation, a smear tactic." The lake was a logistical issue, a design change. "It has no bearing on the bylaws today, doesn't it?" Elias shot back, his voice now a razor-sharp whisper. "Your father used a fraudulent public promise to get the development approved. The very charter they are using to take my land, the one with the clause you and your wife are using as a weapon, is tied to a fraudulent premise. And now you're using that same fraud to try and steal my home. What do you think the county will say? What do you think a judge will say when they see the original zoning permit, the public promise, and the barren field where a public lake was supposed to be?" Richard Albright, the man who had always been a step ahead, looked defeated. He had planned for every contingency, every legal argument, but he had never expected Elias to dig up a 40-year-old family secret, a lie so deeply buried that even he had forgotten about it. His power wasn't in his wealth or his legal team, it was in his ability to control the narrative. And Elias had just completely destroyed it. Eleanor, seeing her husband's humiliation and the horrified faces of her neighbors, finally understood the full extent of Elias's plan. This wasn't just about a gate. It was about the public destruction of her and her husband's reputation. The smug look on her face evaporated, replaced by a ghastly, horrified panic. She was no longer a bully. She was a public spectacle. The final blow came from the board members themselves. A man who had just a moment ago been too afraid to meet Elias's eyes now looked at him with a mix of awe and relief. He had been a pawn in Richard's game, and now he had found a way out. He stood up and said, "I move to immediately rescind the compulsory purchase order." The motion was seconded. The vote was unanimous. The Albrights had not only lost their bid for Elias's land, but they had also lost their power, their position, and their place in the community. Their reign was over. The last act of justice was a quiet one. The next day, a small team of workers arrived at Elias's ranch. They were from the Albrights Contracting Company. They weren't there to bulldoze the gate. They were there to build a new one. A sturdy, beautiful gate made of strong, dark wood and steel. They worked silently and efficiently, as if trying to atone for a decades-old sin. When they were finished, Richard Albright's name was nowhere to be seen on the gate. Just a simple plaque with the words, "Elias Thorne, 1943. He had not only won the war, he had also secured his legacy, a testament to the fact that some things, like a man's home and his history, are simply not for sale. The ranch was safe, and the peace, finally, was his to keep.